Thank you for joining us on Go Open.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really glad to see this show starting.
Bruce, you being the primary author of the open source definition, let's start simply. What is the definition of open source?
Well, open source is not just source code. That's the most important point. It is both a program with source code that you can modify and a set of rights that come along with that program. And without the rights, the source code is useless. These include the right to use, modify, redistribute the software. And it is only those rights that give us the partnership that makes open source possible. How do you think that all of these people have come together to create, we estimate $500 million worth of code just for the Linux kernel? It is the partnership inherent in the rights that open source licensing gives you.
Bruce, you were one of the co-founders of the Open Source Initiative. And a year after co-founding it, you left the Open Source Initiative, and you explained your reasons in an email titled, "It's time to talk about free software again." What were your reasons for leaving the Open Source Initiative?
Well, I have to comment first that although I've walked off that particular project, it's done just fine without me. And that's an important part about open source projects. In general, they are self-sustaining as long as people are willing to keep working on them. My problem with the Open Source Initiative as an organization, and remember this is just an organization of 6 people, is that they had come to deprecate the work of Richard Stallman, and I felt at the time we're moving away from the freedoms that I had put down as being an essential part of open source when I wrote the open source definition. Now, even the open source definition is a work of collaboration. I first proposed it as a policy of the Debian project, and then I refined it over a month with the Debian developers. Eric Raymond contacted me some 6 months later to found the Open Source Initiative. He'd had a meeting with some folks, and they said, we want to promote free software to business, but we don't want to call it free software because free in some business people's minds means shoddy, of low quality, etc. So they had decided, and Christine Peterson is actually the person who coined the name, to call it open source. Eric called me the next day, and I said, fine, I'll take the Debian free software guidelines and file off the serial numbers and call them the open source definition. And that's what we did. And all of the tenets of open source are still valid. I still support them as I support the work of Richard Stallman, who is the real genius whose shoulders we all stand upon. The only problem I had was just the means of promotion, and we've gone on just fine without me on the board of that organization.
What distinguishes free from open?
Richard Stallman feels that you should talk about freedom first and then get to practical matters, like this is great software to run your business. The open source movement is sort of the opposite, but we get to the same place. We say, let's give business people great software that helps them do their work, helps them save money to spend on things that are important to them, gives them the freedom to run their business the way they like. And then, as they get deeper into this software, they will understand that there are freedoms that are important that make this possible, and they will come to accept what Richard Stallman has to say.
Let's talk about Richard for a second. The antagonism he has towards being part of the whole open source movement and still staying in the corner of free. Why would you say is that when open source and free could be quite similarly classified?
Well, I think that Richard is very deeply concerned with the way that we talk about things. And he feels that if we say open source, that we're asking people to forget about freedom. And when Richard says free, Richard means free as in freedom, not free as in zero price. On my side of the issue, I respect Richard. I actually like him quite a lot. And I feel that my role is to be the bridge between a number of rather conservative business people in the world and Richard, who those people might at first consider a bit of a long-haired type. And thus, I sort of take a little gentle approach to those people, while Richard likes to go in and discuss philosophy first. And Richard doesn't really accept that, says he doesn't want to be associated with the open source movement, that his software isn't open source, it's free software. I think that's fine. I think it's fine to call it either one. In some ways, this is sort of like an old Monty Python movie, Life of Brian, where there was this great battle between the People's Judean Front and the People's Front for Judea. What happens is that the people who feel the most similar get into very vicious battles about small points of doctrine. And this is just characteristic of many philosophical movements. It's something that I don't feel people on the outside of those movements see as all that important compared to the people on the inside. So what I'd like to do is say, here's open source software. Try it out. It's going to be very useful for you. And once you understand that there's really something here, take a look at the works of Richard Stallman, because Richard is the giant upon whose shoulders we stand.
Now, the other side of the scale, proprietary software. Is it just well marketed? Because in many ways people say open source is more cost effective, it's better for your business, it can be customizable, and better support. Why do people still go for proprietary software?
Well, there are actually three primary ways to make software for your business. The three ways that you can make software are the retail software paradigm, which is software that is produced with a capital investment by a financier or by a company which has already made some money. And then after all the work has gone into production, that software is sold, often in boxes in computer stores. And that paradigm is very good for making products for the masses, but it's only good for making products for the masses. The overheads of the retail software paradigm are extremely high. We have box design, we have marketing. We actually pay the stores to put the product on their shelves. They don't just buy it and put it on their shelves. It doesn't work that way. So the retail software paradigm has an overhead of about 90%. 10% of your software dollar goes for software development. The second major paradigm for developing software is contract development. Contract development is where you pay a programmer to make a piece of software for you. And you intend that software to be for you and not necessarily to be sold. You may employ that programmer. Of course, businesses of any size employ programmers these days. Or you may contract him as a consultant or an outside company. That is actually the way that most proprietary, and I cross my fingers when I say that, because it's not really the right word. That's the way that most software gets done. And it is very often held close in one organization. And then the third paradigm is open source. Open source is where you can start out the same way you would with contract programming, and you would then open it up to collaborators once it's useful. And what you then find is that many pieces of software are useful to more than one company. And these are pieces of software that would never work in the retail paradigm because they might not be able to build up a mass large enough to support them. And that is what open source is good for. So we take those three paradigms, the retail paradigm, the contract paradigm, and open source, and they're all good for different things.